We are live.
Good evening. Good
Good
evening.
evening. Good
Yes,
evening.
a very special day.
Yeah. Be very welcome, Miss Ambassador. So, só dar um alô para o pessoal que está aqui com a gente. Sejam muito bem-vindos. Eu vou soltar a vinhetinha aqui e a gente começa o nosso episódio. Só lembrando, o episódio de hoje vai ser em inglês, daí vai fazer a introdução e a gente começa. Can we go? Can we begin?
Yep.
Okay.
Olá, gente. Bem-vindos, bem-vindas ao Petit Jornal. Hoje temos mais uma edição do Petit Convida. Esse é o Petit Convida número 13, uma edição especialíssima com o embaixador da Nova Zelândia. E como vocês vão poder observar na sequência, excepcionalmente hoje o nosso encontro será em língua inglesa. Então, quem quiser acompanhar a língua inglesa, sinta-se mais do que à vontade para fazê-lo no podcast, mas quem quiser, estará disponível uma versão com legendas no YouTube, no canal do YouTube do Petit Jornal. Então, uma vez mais, nós damos as boas-vindas ao embaixador da Nova Zelândia e tenho certeza que o Tanguy vai poder fazer as honras e as apresentações. Please, Tanguy, introduce our special guest.
Yeah, so have a very good evening, Ambassador Richard Prendergast. It's a pleasure to welcome to our podcast. We're excited to have the opportunity to talk about Brazil and New Zealand. We have to remember that this year, 2024, we are celebrating the 60 years of that relationship since 1964, if I'm not wrong. And that's the opportunity to talk about that relation, to listen to you about your views about international politics, about Brazil, about your own country. And I'm going to strike the first question and give you the opportunity to introduce yourself. I would like to hear about you, to hear from you. What is New Zealand's role in this tumultuous world of the 21st century? It's not an easy world, and I would like to know, how do you see, what's your take on New Zealand's role in that mess the world is in?
Boa noite, Tanguy, Daniel. Thank you very much for having me. Eu sou Richard, embaixador da Nova Zelândia. Desculpe, gente, eu falo mais ou menos português. Eu vou falar como inglês porque é melhor, incluindo sotaque bonita Kiwi. So thank you very much. I will now speak slowly in English with this Kiwi accent, which is unique. I hope your audience enjoy it. Looking forward to talking about New Zealand and Brazil. Yes, it's the 60-year anniversary of diplomatic relations. What a great question to start with about the challenging world we're in and the role of New Zealand, including the role of diplomacy and how important that is. It is a very difficult environment at the moment. We've seen Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine a few years ago, the tragic events in Gaza, and a range of other food security and climate change crises. How does New Zealand navigate this? New Zealand is very respected internationally because of our strong values and the consistent expression of these values across different governments and across time. To help navigate that complex world that you talked about, we're a strong believer in the international rules-based system. We have to be, because we're a small country and we can't rely on a system that is only about power. So for us, the international system matters, and it gives New Zealand a greater voice on global issues. Some of the areas that we focus on include international conflict resolution, nuclear disarmament and arms control. We're a trade-dependent economy, so we focus in the World Trade Organization on global free trade liberalization. And where possible, we like to build people-to-people connections throughout the world based on those New Zealand values. So hopefully that gives you a sense of how we can try and navigate that difficult environment.
Richard, if I may, I'll call you Richard.
Please.
I would like to hear you about the relations between Brazil and New Zealand. We have 60 years of relations. In what moment are these relations? Maybe a little bit of a background of these relations between Brazil and New Zealand.
Great question. Yeah, 60 years. That's quite a milestone. I see different countries have been doing their promotions. 50 years of China and Brazil has been on Globo TV. The United States have had 200 years with Brazil. New Zealand is very proud to have 60 years. We're obviously a smaller country than those two other countries I mentioned, but we have a very positive and warm relationship with Brazil. It started in 1964. Very interesting, when Brazil's first ambassador, based in Canberra, Australia, presented what they call credentials to our New Zealand Governor General. And I always like hearing those initial stories of how diplomacy started. We then were accredited from Santiago in the 1970s and the 1990s from Buenos Aires. Now, I know how Brazilians feel about that with your rivalry with Argentina. It's great when you actually get an embassy in Brasilia. So we opened an embassy in 2001, and our then Prime Minister, Miss Helen Clark, came and opened the embassy here with your then President. And we recently hosted an event at my residence where we had a montage of the last 60 years of photographs of New Zealand and Brazil. And we came up with a logo, which is on my auto signature, which features the 60 years, but it's a rudder of Brazil and a very similar cousin parrot called the kakapo of New Zealand. So that builds that connection there. In terms of what we're doing in that relationship, as I mentioned, it's very warm and very positive. New Zealand has strong trade links with Brazil. We do a lot in the tourism and education space. That means Brazilian tourists and Brazilian students going to New Zealand and returning. We have lots of interesting little companies doing niche work here in Brazil in agri-tech or security and defence or resources and mining. In the political sort of relationship, we're expecting different ministers to be coming through Brazil. We have our agriculture minister next week. We hope to have a trade minister for G20 meetings later in the year. And that leads nicely, actually mentioned the G20, that Brazil really is on the map at the moment. You're hosting the G20 in Brazil. You'll be hosting the COP30 next year. And that allows New Zealand to bring our ministers up, to have access, to have engagements, and talk about important issues such as trade and investment in the G20 or global climate change in the COP30. So there's quite a richness to the relationship. But what I'd finish with is that's all diplomacy. But what really has brought the warmth to New Zealand and Brazil over 60 years is the people have a similarity in that you have your abraços and beijos culture as brasileiros, very warm, familiar type people. Kiwis, as we like to call ourselves, and I hope brasileiros get to visit our beautiful country, are very warm. We have a concept in Māori, our indigenous culture, called manakitanga, which is to show respect to foreign visitors. And so when Brazilians come to New Zealand, they tend to have a heart full of happiness and warmth and hospitality from the very kind New Zealand people. And I think that's built a really good connection between our two countries.
And how long have you been in Brazil? 2 years, maybe?
Yes, just over 2.5 years. And I came up at the sort of tail end of the pandemic. I arrived with my family via the flights from Dubai. It took over 50 hours to get here. Luckily, we now have better air connections. I was wearing the COVID mask, but things are a lot better here. A little bit about why we came here too. My wife is Brasileira, Helena.
Okay.
So she would say to your audience that I should have better Portuguese. It's a work on. But it was the only post we applied for because of the fit with family. I have 2 beautiful children, Isabel, who's 8, and Felipe, a good Brazilian name, who's 5, nearly 5. They're both half Brasileiro, half Kiwi, and they're fluent in Portuguese, the language of their mum. In fact, Isabel is my minha professora. It's very humbling speaking Portuguese with an 8-year-old. But it's been a wonderful posting here for our family because we get to spend a lot of time with the wider Brazilian family. She's a Paulista. Sorry to my Carioca friends who I'm talking to. I understand that rivalry.
Nobody's perfect. That's okay.
Yeah, but exactly, great answer. But we're having a very rich family experience combined with my very interesting professional job here.
Yeah, I was going to ask about your experience living in Brazil, but that's not exactly a shock. You live with a Brazilian, so that's nice to hear that you're a New Zealander, but you're quite Brazilian too. We can adopt you.
Oh, I love that. Oh, I can talk a little bit about it. I think I've done about 10 visits over 10 years with my wife, and now we're living here. Brasilia, where we live, is great for the family with a sunny climate, and it's safe, and the kids have a good school. We visit the family in Sao Paulo, as I mentioned. I love coming to the Cidade Maravilhosa here. It's a wonderful city, physically stunning with the wonderful Carioca people. But I really enjoy Brazil for a range of reasons, whether that's the things that you see in the news that gringos will notice about the popular things of Brazil, such as football or bossa nova music, and I really enjoy both of those. But when you dig deeper and you have a really interesting political and economic and social system that as a diplomat I need to be across and understand. But as I've got to know Brazilians every day over the last 2.5 years, and again, as I mentioned, that warm abraços and beijos culture, the familia being really important, the youth and energy and vibrancy that Brazilians have. It's a very rich experience for myself and my family to be here.
Richard, could you tell us a little bit about your background? What have you done in your life, your experiences before coming to Brazil?
Yes, happy to, in case I know you have a very informed audience, and if they're interested in the world of diplomacy or journalism like you're both good selves, because there are linkages there, it is a fascinating career. I joined the New Zealand Diplomatic Service around 24 years ago, in the year 2000. That will show my age, that people can figure that out. That was very exciting. I joined a graduate program. I'd gone to university and studied international relations, which I was always fascinated by the world since I was a little boy. And then I worked in sort of trade and economic work in Wellington. And then my first posting was in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, which was a fascinating experience, again, doing trade work. I always had a real passion and interest for the world and for promoting New Zealand, a country I love, so the two came together. And then my sort of subset specialty and interest moved into security, actually, after doing the trade work. And I worked on the Afghanistan desk. This is 10 years ago now, when Afghanistan was at a very difficult time, a bit longer, 2010, 14 years ago. And then I did a mid-career master's on Afghanistan. It became this Afghanistan journey. And then the foreign ministry decided to deploy a diplomat to the Hindu Kush mountains in Afghanistan alongside the soldiers. And you could imagine it was pretty easy to find someone in the ministry who might be interested. Was myself, who had that background. So I was honoured to be asked to go. Most people would be a little bit concerned about that, but for me it was a great opportunity to serve my country and help people there. That was a fascinating experience, and it's very sad what happened a few years ago with the fall of Kabul, and we saw the return of the Taliban. And I worked on a crisis centre in Wellington.
Ele caiu, vai voltar.
Mainly women and girls who I'd been working with 10, 15 years ago to leave Afghanistan and have a better life in New Zealand. After Afghanistan, I went to Washington, D.C. during the Obama term and worked again in security and political work and foreign policy. And my daughter was born there. So she likes to tell people that she was born in the US, but she's half Brazilian and half Kiwi. So it's quite a story. and then we returned to Wellington, where my son was born, and here we are now in Brazil. So it's been a fascinating journey of working around the world on a range of different issues.
If I may, I would like to know more about the diplomatic process or the diplomatic career in New Zealand, because here in Brazil, the selection process to become a diplomat is quite demanding, it's quite challenging. How does that work in New Zealand? What is the process or the
How do you
way
apply? How do you apply for the job?
to be a diplomat?
Yes. Yeah, great questions. And I know Itamata, who I deal with on an almost daily basis, have very professional diplomats that are great assets for your country, and they really represent Brazil very professionally. And I know the competition is challenging there. In New Zealand, like many countries, there is a similar level of competition because people desire the interest and thought of representing their country, which allows, with so many people applying for the Foreign Ministry, to have quite a high bar of the type of people they're looking for. There's an annual recruitment. It was called a graduate program when I first joined. It is now called an early in careers program, which allows graduates plus perhaps people who have worked for a few years to have some work and life experience. They're looking for people that have a high quality tertiary degree, university education. It can be a range of subjects. Yes, I did international relations, which is quite orthodox. We have a lot of people who've done law. A lot of people do languages, of course, but we have people from a range of disciplines. It's really about their ability to think and write and to help solve problems. And then outside of the selection of number of people once a year and the university process, we're looking for people that are well-rounded, who have a passion for New Zealand, have a curious interest in the world, will represent our country with what we call mana, which is real standing and respect. So people with deep integrity, people who really understand New Zealand, particularly our bicultural history and our current multicultural society, and how we can project a Te Ao Māori worldview to the world. Languages are clearly a real skill and bonus. I have this beautiful Kiwi English. I have okay Portuguese, and I'm learning Te Reo Māori, and certainly the younger generation coming through are fluent in many languages. And that gives them then an opportunity. If they're selected, they will go through an interview process and a further selection process. They will usually do 2, 3 or 4 years in Wellington, the capital, in a particular division. And then they get to apply for a posting. And that's a very exciting time for a young New Zealander to be a diplomat for their country at an embassy offshore. I remember that when I was a first-time diplomat in Malaysia 17 years ago. I think of what a buzz it is to represent your country every day, and what a responsibility and an opportunity.
I have been to New Zealand, and when
great.
I was there, when I was there, I saw a very organized country. When I think about New Zealand, I think about a country that have smart solutions for complex problems. And said that, I'd like to hear you about the Maori Crown relations, because it seems to be something that should be very hard. But in New Zealand, it's not. In New Zealand, you have a very good relation with the Maori. How could that be possible? How did you do that?
Yeah, look, great question, and the points you made before that too. That's awesome that you visited Aotearoa, New Zealand. It says the Māori name for New Zealand. That means land of the long white cloud. I hope you experienced some of that Manaki culture, that warm culture from the Kiwis there. And interesting that you noticed the technical solutions and the orderedness. Because New Zealand's a small country, small population, but a developed economy, we're often seen as a good testing ground for innovation. And there's a lot of creative people in New Zealand. So Lord of the Rings is obviously very famous in the film industry. And of course, that was filmed and produced and directed in New Zealand. And so there's quite a creative industry there. part of the tourism culture that you would have seen, part of those creative minds you would have noticed, is the Maori people. So they are the indigenous people of New Zealand, just for your wider audience. They are a hugely prominent part of our society, and there is a really close partnership between the European people. And how that came about, just a good observation, is what is called the Treaty of Waitangi, which was a treaty signed in 1840 between the British Crown and the chiefs of the Māori tribes, or iwi as they're called. And that put in place a fundamental partnership. But we need to be humble about the journey. Yes, it was a promising beginning, and yes, we're in a very good space today, nearly 200 years later. But like many colonial stories, it was very challenging there, where the European settlers and others, through persuasion or forced land grabs, did take a lot of the Māori land. Māori people were dispossessed, and that led to very difficult times for the Māori people, and culminated in the Waitangi Tribunal in the 1970s and the subsequent 50 years of a redress process of compensation in monetary value or lands, which has helped lead to a better picture today of a more unified country with Māori people and European people, and with immigration and multicultural society. That treaty, the principles of it, really help that partnership. That's the first word. The 3 Ps of the treaty, partnership, participation, and protection, have been fundamental to the Treaty of Waitangi and the good relations between Māori people and European people.
Since we're back to politics, we are aware that New Zealand is not Australia, but we know that Australia is quite cautious about China. What is the take of New Zealand itself about China? How do New Zealand sees the role of China towards itself, towards New Zealand?
Yeah, look, very good observation on Australia and great question on China. Just briefly on Australia, they are our only formal military ally, so we rely on significant protection from Australia and provide military support in return. It's our closest relationship. Large numbers of New Zealanders live in Australia. My brother lives in Australia with an Australian partner and half Australian children. That's a common story. We have the same language. The rest of the world think we have the same Sataki, Aussie and Kiwi. To each other, it's very different. Think of Northeast versus the South, or Karioka versus Sao Paulo. And it's a source of funny stories. We have a shared military history together, where we've fought very closely against global aggression to protect each other. And the only rivalry, but it's a very significant one, is in the sporting rivalry, where there's real passion and debate between Australia and New Zealand. But great observation on Australia's challenges and relationships with Canada. With New Zealand, like many countries, including Brazil, China is very important to New Zealand. It's our largest trading partner. We are a trade-dependent economy, so large numbers of New Zealand exports do go to China initially, and in a high percentage in the dairy space, but moving into a lot more other sophisticated parts of the economy too. But New Zealand also has a broad diversification portfolio of exporting to a range of other markets in Asia, in Europe, and Latin America, such as Brazil. And with China, we have to navigate the relationship as China's rise and the geopolitical shifts that accompany that, including with the United States. Where we need to, we will have discussions with China publicly and privately around issues that matter to New Zealand's values, whether that's on some of the issues that you see in the news around the South China Sea, or Hong Kong, or democracy more broadly. and our conversations that we ensure we do in a clear way and in a considered way with China, as you would expect in a mature relationship that we have.
I have, Mr. Ambassador, two sisters that lives in Australia, and I can say, besides everything that you have said, that New Zealand All Blacks is much better than Australian national rugby team, but they cannot hear that I have said that. But I would like to hear you about the haka. Haka is a international phenomenon. What's haka? What's haka means, and for those who doesn't understand what the haka the haka that the All Blacks do every time that they play.
Yeah, that's awesome that you've talked about that, because your audience will be very interested. Some would have seen it, some would be familiar. For those that aren't, please Google it while you're listening to YouTube, the haka. So the haka is a Māori word meaning a traditional Māori performance, essentially a war dance. The origins of the haka are different Māori tribes that I talked about when going into battle. Initially against each other, later against the British Crown that we talked about in the history of New Zealand. It was a way for those tribes or those iwi and those warriors to sort of physically psych themselves up for battle. It was a way to show physical prowess. It was an opportunity to intimidate the opposition, particularly in a war or a conflict. But it also brought a lot of cultural pride and strength and unity to that particular iwi. There are some slightly different variations across different tribes or iwi. And then the history of the haka has evolved. It was then used by the Māori battalion in World War I and World War II. It has moved into being made famous globally by the All Blacks when they go to compete against other countries, including Australia. And there it's shown as a sign of respect. It's laying down the gauntlet of a challenge. I will take you on the physical rugby game, for example, but also a sign of real respect. And that's why it can be popularised today in events such as sporting events or funerals or what's called a palfrey, which is a traditional welcome, because it really is showing cultural respect, that manaakitanga we talked about, providing mana, which is that real leadership. And for a foreign audience, it's incredibly powerful to watch. People with so much passion and energy put into that war dance. So I'd encourage listeners to go and have a look online. It's a really wonderful and rich part of our culture.
Ambassador, we've begin with our conversation here talking about the role of New Zealand in the world. You're the ambassador of New Zealand to Brazil, so I would like to hear you about your views about the role of Brazil. How do you see Brazil? Do you think that Brazil can aim something bigger, stronger in its foreign policy? How do you from New Zealand and you as an ambassador see the role of Brazil in the world as it is now?
Great question. Brazil is a very important actor in global affairs, and your audience should feel very proud about that. If you think of perceptions of Brazil globally, you're a large country, both geography and number of people. You're democratic. You have a vibrant culture, and you have a respected voice on the global stage. And your current president is very active at connecting with global leaders, which gives access and spotlight and influence for Brazil. New Zealand works very closely with Brazil on the international stage. We complement each other well. New Zealand is small, but we have a respected moral voice on our interests and values. Brazil was a large geopolitical player from Latin America that has real influence because of its size and its voice. Brazil was doing a lot of good work in the World Trade Organization around agriculture liberalization to help your economy and the world economy, and New Zealand worked closely with Brazil there. New Zealand with Brazil worked very closely in the global New Agenda Coalition, which is an effort to do nuclear disarmament so we can have a world free without nuclear weapons, and that should be a great goal. Brazil and New Zealand are doing a lot of really progressive work in areas such as climate change, and of course you'll be hosting COP30 in Berlin next year, as well as a global trade and gender arrangement. And there are opportunities in the global stage for Brazil and New Zealand in indigenous connections as well. So there is, Brazil is an important player. It has a respected voice. And one of its greatest assets is that you have an ability in foreign policy to maintain positive relationships with almost all countries in the world. And that's a very hard feat to achieve. And that allows Brazil to have a balanced approach, to be a neutral mediator when required. And that gives them a respected voice on key issues of international concern.
After COVID and the war in Ukraine, the world seems to be more encapsulated and less open. We have rising customs barriers, nearshoring, and a less integrated world. How do you see it? Is this going to stay like this? How do you see the near future and the long run?
It is a challenging time. Good observation from COVID that we talked about when I first arrived in Brazil at the end of it, to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And that particularly is important for small countries in the world, because we need countries to stand up against aggression. The difficult events we see happening in Gaza at the moment, and some of those economic challenges you talk about. Our foreign minister recently spoke about all this international turmoil, and so you can find his information publicly available. But what he talked about was what New Zealand foreign policy saw as three big shifts in this very challenging world. And that was firstly from rules to power, that many countries, particularly big aggressive countries, are trying to contest rules and shape relative power through their role. It's important for New Zealand as a small country, and for Brazil as a like-minded democratic country, that we really hold on to international rules as part of stability. The second shift that we noticed, that our foreign minister talked about, was from economics to security, where we're moving away from perhaps open economic regimes, and New Zealand needs to have international free trade, to seeing increased engagement in the economy that has a security lens, or where there's increased military competition, and that can be very challenging. And the third one, Danielle, which you observed yourself, around the nearshoring, post-COVID and post that challenging world, it's inevitable for countries and economies to move from what we call efficiency to resilience, where in terms of their economic behaviour. And so that's the challenging space. So then how do we navigate that? Well, that's where diplomats are very important. And our foreign minister talked about, in that difficult world and in those challenging shifts, it's very important that we understand each other's positions, and the Brazilians are very good at doing that. From understanding comes opportunity. From diplomacy comes compromise, which are the building blocks of better international relations. So we would argue, in that difficult world you've described, and I'd agree with, we need more diplomacy and more engagement.
Doing our homework for this interview, for this conversation, we hear that Brazil is an agricultural powerhouse, and New Zealand is also an agricultural powerhouse. And we know that New Zealand is making huge investments in Brazil, in the south of Brazil, most of all, on agriculture. what's your take on that? What's the importance of these investments? How do you think that these investments can lead this relationship from now on?
Yeah, agriculture is a really important modern part of the cooperation of Brazil and New Zealand. I think I mentioned earlier in our talk about different ministers coming to visit. Next week, the New Zealand Minister of Agriculture will be visiting Brasilia, and we hope to meet with your Minister of Agriculture. And the type of things they'll talk about include that cooperation in the World Trade Organization on agriculture liberalisation that can benefit the world in terms of food security and prosperity and trade opportunities. We work very closely with Brazil in sustainable agriculture because climate change is a real crisis all countries are facing. Yet New Zealand and Brazil also have very strong agricultural economies, which are a backbone of our societies, our economy, and our livelihoods and jobs. So both countries need to continue with agriculture, but how do they do it sustainably? So there's very good areas of cooperation between Brazil and New Zealand scientists, our farmers, and our research organisations around technology to make agriculture more sustainable. And then the third piece is what you allude to, Tangi, is particularly in the south of Brazil, but also in other parts of Brazil, Mato Grosso and Goiás and Bahia. There's active New Zealand cooperation, what we call agri-tech, which is really trying to bring New Zealand farming expertise to Brazil so that it benefits Brazilian farmers and Brazilian people. And some examples of that New Zealand agri-tech includes genetics, so actually bringing genetics from New Zealand cows. So in the state of Goiás and in the state of Bahia, you actually have Kiwi cows making Kiwi milk. It's a pretty cool story, but with Brazilian sun and Brazilian grass and Brazilian love, it's quite a combination. And they use things like Kiwi electric fences so that instead of the cows eating boring food, they can move around each day into a different fence and eat beautiful green grass. That is the key to fresh milk. And then these Kiwi companies working with Brazilians are producing beautiful fresh milk for your young people, which is a great source of growth and energy and builds that particular relationship. So it's a really nice story. I visited these Kiwi farms in Goiás and in Bahia. I hope to go down to the south of Brazil soon and really enjoy seeing the partnership between Brazilian and Kiwi farmers.
I would like to ask you about New Zealand as an educational destination. Maybe that's something that is going to be interesting for some of our friends that hear this talk.
Yeah, exactly. New Zealand is a very popular education destination for Brazilians. We have the advantage, like Australia, Canada, UK, US and other countries, of speaking English, which we're rather fortunate as the global language of business and education. So many Brazilians like to study in one of those countries to improve their English, is usually the underlying reason. I will be a self-promoter for New Zealand and say you have the chance to hear American English on TV. Brazilians know it. You can hear the beautiful, posh British English, but there's nothing like the Sataki Kiwi, which you're hearing now. So Brazilians come to New Zealand and study, and you'll learn English with a great accent that's unique. So that is an opportunity. And when Brazilians come down, sometimes it's to learn English, generally the start of the journey, but it can broaden out to doing tertiary study or postgraduate study in a range of subjects in New Zealand where we have high quality institutions. Generally their experience is really positive. They do tourism as well and see our natural landscapes, engage with the Māori culture and enjoy beautiful New Zealand wine. And then we've met a number of Brazilians that have studied in New Zealand and had those experiences of Sataki Kiwi or the Māori culture or coming back with friendships. And they end up being very passionate about New Zealand and they're great advocates, almost informal ambassadors for New Zealand because they're in areas of commerce or sport or government in Brazil but they talk so highly of New Zealand. We call them New Zealand alumni. They're a small network of Brazilians that have that New Zealand connection. So we find people like that and young students from some of your schools around New Zealand in Brazil, that are studying in New Zealand, are the future of the relationship. So we've talked about the 60 years in the past, the people-to-people links, but the 60 years going forward is going to be built on young Brazilians studying in New Zealand, living in New Zealand, having a wonderful experience, making friendships, learning our language, and bringing it back to Brazil, and vice versa, so that New Zealanders like myself, my children, or New Zealand business people that come to Brazil, that becomes the thickness of the relationship is around education and leads to deep people-to-people links between Brasileiros and Kiwis.
Ambassador Richard Prendergast, it was a pleasure to have you here. We want to thank you so much. I'll let you have your final message before closing this episode, but I have to say thank you on behalf of the audience and on behalf of this humble podcast of Petit Jornal.
Muito obrigado, Tanguy e Daniel. Muito obrigado to the Brasileiros and Brasileiras that were listening. It's a real honor to be the ambassador for New Zealand. It's an incredible honor to be the ambassador to your wonderful country of Brazil. You have a beautiful country with a vibrant culture, with that wonder familiar aspect to it. Feel very proud about who you are, and thank you to Brazilians for allowing us to have a positive 60 years relationship. Muito obrigado.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you. Obrigado, gente.
Muito
Até a
obrigado.
próxima.
Obrigado pela presença. Um abraço e até a próxima, gente. Valeu.
Tchau, tchau.
Tchau, tchau.